All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the Emerald Ash Borer informational meeting. This is for the new find in Pope County. And so I'm just going to give a broad overview of Emerald Ash Borer. We'll go through a number of things. I'll show the agenda here in a second. But as an introduction, I'm Jonathan Ostis with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's Plant Protection Division. I am the Emerald Ash Borer Technical Assistance Coordinator. So you can see my contact information there on the screen. And below that is my colleague, Danielle DeVito, who handles all of the regulatory aspects when we're talking about Emerald Ash Borer. So dealing with quarantines and firewood regulations, things like that. At any time, feel free to put questions into the chat. I'll either address them as we go or I will answer them at the end, which we'll have time for more questions and answers at that point. But yeah, I'm going to get moving. I'm recording this presentation, so I will make it available within a couple days after this. If you know of people that would benefit from learning about Emerald Ash Borer in your area, we'll have a recording for them. Or if you would like to just use it as a reference, that'll be available as well. We have previously recorded meetings available on our MDA Emerald Ash Borer webpage as well. So with that, I'm going to get started here. So here's the agenda for the presentation. I'm going to start with the life cycle, kind of the biology of the insect. Then we'll talk about host trees, how to recognize Emerald Ash Borer, how to properly identify it, and then we'll cover signs and symptoms, the known distribution in the state of Minnesota, regulations, and then kind of your options for management at kind of that landscape level and what individuals can do with the ash trees on their property. And lastly, we'll cover the best ways to report potential new infestations. All right. So just a little bit of background. Emerald ash borer is a metallic wood-boring beetle. It's not native to North America, and so its native range is in kind of the northeastern parts of Asia, so parts of China, the Russian Far East, Japan, North and South Korea, Taiwan. So that's where it originates from. It showed up sometime in the early to mid 90s into the Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario area. And so it went undetected for a while, and it wasn't officially identified until 2002. And at that point, there were thousands of dead and dying ash trees throughout that Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario area. And it's thought that Emerald ash borer arrived via solid wood packaging material into the ports there. And so by the time it was identified, lots of infested ash firewood and ash nursery stock had been moved out of that area to new locations, kind of kicking off the rapid spread of Emerald ash borer throughout North America. So where we find ourselves now, I mean, Emerald ash borer was found in Minnesota in 2009. So it's been 15 years since it was first identified in Minnesota. And we're now at 52 counties out of 87 counties that have known infestations. And North America, more broadly speaking, we have 38 states and 6 Canadian provinces that have Emerald ash borer infestations. And so some of the more recent larger jumps were finds in right outside Portland, Oregon, and most recently in Vancouver, British Columbia. So it's taken some big jumps, and it's throughout much of the eastern half of the U.S. All right, so now we'll just cover the life cycle here. So Emerald ash borer beetles are now active, so they have begun emerging throughout the state. We have, for the life cycle of Emerald ash borer, we have the active period, so the adult flight season, and the non-active period. So the Emerald ash borer adult beetles are active from May through September in Minnesota, and so its initial emergence typically it varies when it happens, especially depends on where you are in the state as well. But we use growing degree days to kind of predict when that initial emergence will start happening. But it typically happens sometime between mid-May and the early part of June. And so once those beetles begin emerging, they then do a little bit of maturation feeding in the canopy of the tree. So they kind of nibble on the leaves of the ash trees for a couple of days. And this isn't really noticeable to the naked eye. It's nothing like you'd see with, say, Japanese beetle where they skeletonize the leaves. So it's not something you'd actually notice. But after that, those several days of feeding on the foliage, they'll then go find a mate. And then the beetles will mate and begin laying eggs in the bark cracks and crevices of ash trees within a week or two after that. And so, emerald ash borer, when they're first infesting a tree, starts in the mid to upper canopy and works its way down. So they begin laying their eggs in those branches and stems between 2 to 6 inches in diameter, kind of where that bark transitions from smooth to rough. And they typically begin laying their eggs on the south or southwest facing side of the tree, the side of the tree that gets the most amount of direct sunlight. And so the average emerald ash borer female beetle will lay on average between 60 to 90 eggs in their lifetime. And so you can see how that population can really start to build quite quickly. So once those eggs are laid, within a week or two, those eggs will hatch, and then the larvae will burrow through the bark and begin feeding in that cambium layer of the tree. So this is what does the damage to the tree. It's the larval tunneling that disrupts the flow of water nutrients between the root system and the crown. And so once enough emerald ash borer is built up on a tree, it effectively girdles the tree and kills the tree. It's also why the emerald ash borer starts in the mid to upper canopy of a tree and works its way down, because if it started on the trunk of the tree, it would girdle that tree much faster and kill that food source. So once those larvae begin tunneling underneath the bark, they go through what we call 4 larval instars, and those are just growing sizes. So they go through these 4 growing stages. Once they go through those 4 growing stages, they then chew a pupal chamber, as you can see in that center picture there, where the larva is folded over. That's what we call a J larva. And so once they chew that pupal chamber, they're done feeding in that cambium layer. They've done the damage that they're going to do. And then they wait there. Then the following spring and summer, when it heats up again, it will pupate, turn into the adult beetle, and start that process all over again. So what I just described to you there is a 1-year life cycle. And we have both a 1-year and 2-year life cycle in Minnesota. So just to give you an idea of how that 2-year life cycle works, an emerald ash borer egg that was laid in the summer of 2023, so last summer, it hatched. The larva made it partway through its larval development before going dormant for all of this last winter. This spring and summer, it will continue its larval development until it makes its way to its pupal chamber, and then it will overwinter a second time. And next spring and summer, it'll emerge as an adult beetle in the summer of 2025. So you can really have any immature larval stage underneath the bark at any time of year. That's important when you think about things like firewood and things like that. All right. So, like I had already kind of mentioned a little bit, how emerald ash borer kills a tree. It's really the number of emerald ash borer larvae that build up in an ash tree that end up killing it, that overwhelm the tree and eventually girdle the tree, stopping the flow of water nutrients between the root system and the crown. So an ash tree can withstand, a couple emerald ash borer tunneling around underneath the bark there, but it's really once a bunch of eggs have been laid, it overwhelms the tree and it effectively girdles it. So a large mature ash tree can produce thousands of beetles, and so that is really how emerald ash borer kills a tree. It's the larval stage of the insect. And one of the major issues with emerald ash borer and why it's such a problem is, it's cryptic in nature. You typically don't see, signs of infestation in the tree till it's been there a couple of years. And so what you typically have is what we see in this curve here. We kind of call it the death curve. And so, when emerald ash borer first gets established in an area, the populations grow slowly at first. But within a few years, with each female beetle laying on average between 60 to 90 eggs apiece, that population eventually explodes. And then, there's a lag time of a couple years after that population explosion when you start to see a lot of trees die in a short amount of time. So the real issue is having that population explode and then, a lot of trees that you have to deal with in a very short period of time that decline quite rapidly. And so that is the major issue. And I will say early detection. So finding infestations as early as possible is much more beneficial to you than finding things already far along. So, if you do any sort of management when populations are still in that early building phase, it'll have a much bigger impact than when that's already in that big population explosion phase. So early detection is really important message here. So keep an eye out for signs and symptoms in your area. All right. So host trees. It is all true ash trees are impacted by emerald ash borer. So that's anything in the Fraxinus species. Mountain ash is not a true ash, so you don't have to worry about that. And so ash trees have opposite branching, compound leaves, and 5 to many leaflets. And so you can see some examples of green ash tree in these pictures right here, as that kind of diamond ridged bark. And you'll see in that picture on the right, those are kind of green tree wraps that a lot of communities will put on ash trees in highly visible areas downtown or in parks to help people recognize, that ash trees are very common in the landscape, and they likely have some on their property if they're a homeowner or a property owner. And so in Minnesota, we have 3 types of native ash trees. We have black ash, green ash, and white ash. And as you can see, they're all highly susceptible to emerald ash borer. It really is about a 98 or 99% mortality rate. And so green ash is found throughout the entire state. It's the most common tree planted in right-of-ways, boulevards, yards, windrows. And then we have large swaths of black ash forest, especially in north central and northeastern Minnesota. That's where the bulk of our ash forest resource comes from. And then we have pockets of white ash in the eastern part of the state in the more upland areas. But white ash is also a very common, boulevard or planted tree, landscape tree. And so they're all highly susceptible to emerald ash borer, unfortunately. And once it's in an area, it will be killed by emerald ash borer without a tree being treated with insecticide. All right, and um, we we are the state with the most amount of ash in the lower 48. So we have about 1 billion ash trees throughout the state of Minnesota. And on top of that, most communities rely pretty heavily on ash to make up their community forest. So what oftentimes, especially in western Minnesota, you'll find that ash makes up anywhere from 30 to 60% of the trees that you find planted throughout town. So it will have a big impact. And if you haven't started preparing for it yet, now is a good time to begin working on how you're going to deal with it when it starts impacting your trees. Um, Before I go on to recognizing how to recognize emerald ash borer, I will mention there is a secondary host. It's called the white fringe tree. It's in the olive family. It's not native to Minnesota, but it is an ornamental shrub that you will find sold at nurseries and whatnot throughout the state. So if you're looking for a new ornamental shrub to plant in your yard, we just suggest you don't plant the white fringe tree, as it is a host for emerald ash borer, and it will go to it once all the other ash trees in the area have been killed. All right, so how to identify emerald ash borer? Really, there's 4 main ways to do this. The most common way to identify emerald ash borer is by finding that S-shaped feeding gallery. So emerald ash borer makes a very distinct larval tunneling shape in ash trees. So if you find that distinct S-shaped tunneling but from an insect on the surface of the wood, that is distinct for emerald ash borer if it's in an ash tree. So that really is the #1 way that we identify a tree as infested. A lot of times there'll be woodpecker damage and things like that, that you can see part of that S-shaped tunneling pattern on the surface of the wood in that area. So that really is the best way to identify emerald ash borer in an ash tree. Next, there is the larva itself. So if you pull insect larva out of an ash tree, the way to identify if it's emerald ash borer is if it has what you see circled there in red. There's 2 little spine-like projections at the tail end of the larva, and those are called the urogomphia. They're just 2 little black pincers at the tail end. And if you pull a larva out of an ash tree and it has those 2 little black pincers, you know you have emerald ash borer. We have other insects that have 1 of those or none of them, but if you have 2 of them and it came from an ash tree, you know it's emerald ash borer. Next is the adult beetle itself. So emerald ash borer is about a 1/2 inch long by about an 1/8 inch wide, so it's not all that big. It has that kind of bright iridescent green colored wing covers, and then you have that kind of magenta or deep reddish colored abdomen. And so it is very distinct looking. I will say, when it's first getting established in an area, you don't often come across the beetles themselves, but it does happen. Oftentimes people will see the six-spotted tiger beetle run across their sidewalk or their deck or something like that, and we'll confuse it for emerald ash borer because it's bright green in color. But the emerald ash borer is very distinct looking, and if you do happen to see it, try to collect it and take a picture of it, and we can help identify it if you report it to us. And then lastly, the emerald ash borer does leave a D-shaped exit hole when leaving the tree. I mentioned this last because it's probably the worst thing to look for if you're trying to identify emerald ash borer. The beetles themselves are only about an 1/8 inch wide, and they're not very big. So finding that on a large mature tree with thick bark can be very difficult. And if you can see obvious D-shaped exit holes at eye level, if you were to look up into the canopy of the tree, you would see a lot of decline and symptoms that would let you know that that tree is infested far before when you could see that exit hole at eye level. So really be looking for the S-shaped feeding gallery, that tunneling pattern, and things like that first. And then I'll go over kind of the signs and symptoms that you'll see earlier on in your trees in here in just a moment. And there's other insects that'll leave exit holes that are oval shaped or more round. It can be kind of confusing. So if you have permission and you find an exit hole that you think is suspect for emerald ash borer, if you can dig in with a knife to remove the bark to look for that feeding gallery underneath, that would be a better way to identify it. All right, so here is just one of our outreach documents that show, a bunch of insects that are commonly confused with emerald ash borer. You can see emerald ash borer circled up there in the top left. And then the insect I mentioned earlier as well is that six-spotted tiger beetle down in the bottom right. That's the one that's most commonly confused with emerald ash borer. And that's very commonly reported to us, from the end of May through June. And you can see the body type is quite different, but they are of a similar size. All right, signs and symptoms. So the number one thing that we use to look for early detection of emerald ash borer is woodpecker feeding damage. And so woodpeckers will feed on any insect underneath the bark of trees, but they leave a distinct look when they're going after emerald ash borer in ash trees. And so, like I mentioned, emerald ash borer typically shows up in those branches between 2 to 6 inches in diameter in the mid to upper canopy of a tree. And when the woodpeckers go after these larvae underneath the bark, they go after these late instar larvae, they will fleck off in what we call bark blonding or flecking. And they create these blonde patches on the branches of the trees. And so that is something that can clue you into where to look. And so in those blonded areas, you need to look for actual woodpecker holes. And so those are kind of dime-sized, light-colored, oval-shaped, shallow woodpecker holes. They're just going deep enough to get to the larva underneath the bark. And so they leave this kind of distinct light-colored pattern and woodpecker holes in the canopy of trees that you can pick out, especially in the winter and spring months when there's no leaves on the tree. So that's when we do the majority of our emerald ash borer survey, is when there's no leaves on ash trees. So it's much easier to see up into the canopy. And oftentimes, if you have a nice pair of binoculars, you can find a portion where enough bark has been removed by the woodpecker to actually see some of that S-shaped feeding gallery, so the tunneling pattern that the larva makes. And that's one way to identify it early. And so here are some more examples of that. In that picture on the left, that's another green ash. You can see that light blonding where the outer bark has been flaked off. And then you see those shallow woodpecker holes within those blonded areas. That center picture is of a black ash. And so the black ash bark color is a little bit different. So sometimes that blonding doesn't stick out quite as much, but it still in general has the same symptoms. And then again, there's another green ash in the picture on the right that's heavily infested. You can see there's woodpecker damage and blonding all the way down to the trunk, all the way down the trunk of the tree. And the bark is actually starting to fall off at the base. And so you want to find it when it's in those branches and you're seeing sparse damage as opposed to that picture on the right where the tree is completely heavily infested. Other things you might see are bark splits. So when emerald ash borer initially infests an ash tree, the tree will respond to it by trying to kind of heal around that larval tunneling gallery. And so it'll build up callus tissue to try to cordon off that wound. and as it continues to grow, it'll build up that callus tissue, and that bark will actually separate from the surface of the wood where that larval tunneling gallery is, and create a nice vertical split. And oftentimes you can see that S-shaped tunneling pattern on the surface of the wood in between a bark split. So that's just another thing you might see after a tree's been infested for a couple of years. And so here's some more examples of that. See on the image on the left, there's long vertical cracks all along that main stem. And then if you look in that picture on the right, this one's a little bit more sneaky. If you look to the top center of that picture, there's actually a split right there that you can see part of that S-shaped tunneling pattern within that split at the very top center part of the picture. All right, and then lastly, canopy thinning and epicormic sprouting. Those are common symptoms that you'll see in a declining tree that's being killed by emerald ash borer. In general, the tree is dying from the top down. You see an overall thinning, so a lot fewer leaves, smaller leaves, a lot more light penetrating through the canopy. And very often what you'll see is like that picture on the right, where you see that canopy getting really thin on the outside and on the top. And then you see a lot of water sprouts or epicormic sprouting along the main stem in the lower part of the canopy, creating that real bushy-like appearance. And so that's a very common look when you're seeing a tree decline from emerald ash borer. All right, so symptom progression. So this is on average kind of what you see on average. This can take a little bit longer or it can go faster, kind of depending on the insect pressure in an area and the size tree you're dealing with. So on average, it takes around 5 years to kill a tree from initial infestation to tree death. If you're in a really heavily infested area, tree death can occur in as little as 3 to 4 years. With so much emerald ash borer out there, it can go quicker. If it's the first kind of, if emerald ash borer is just getting established in an area, it could take more like 5, 6, or 7 years to kill a tree. So this is on average. And in that first year of infestation, you're not going to see any signs or symptoms that will let you know that that tree is infested. There will be no outward symptoms to be able to identify. And the only way to identify an infested tree in that year one of infestation is by doing what we call branch sampling. And that requires cutting 2 3-foot sections of branch from the mid to upper canopy and then peeling the bark off with a draw knife to look for larvae underneath. And so that's a very labor intensive process. And it gives you about a 70 or 75% chance of identifying emerald ash borer in an asymptomatic tree. So, in that second year of infestation, you have more emerald ash borer building up in that tree. If the woodpeckers have found that food source, you may have a few woodpecks visible. So it is possible to identify it in that second year, but it's pretty unlikely, and you have to be paying very close attention. It's really in that year 3 of infestation when you're going to see some bark splits and woodpecker damage will become much more obvious on a number of branches throughout the canopy. And at this point, there may be minor canopy impacts, but likely the average person is not going to notice anything. If the tree was an otherwise healthy tree before emerald ash borer started attacking it, it takes a while for that canopy decline to catch up. And so, looking for that woodpecker damage in the wintertime up in the canopy of your ash trees is the best way to go. It's really in that year 4 of infestation when you really start to see those visible canopy impacts, in which at the point when most people realize, especially homeowners, that something is wrong with their tree. And so it kind of that year 3 to year 4 is when that tree goes from a potentially treatable tree with insecticide to be saved or to a non-treatable tree. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but in general, a tree is still treatable if there's no more than 30% canopy decline. So you still need at least 70% of a healthy canopy for a tree to be a good candidate for treatment. And so, once you get to year 5, year 6, you're seeing woodpecker damage all the way down the trunk of the tree. There's basically no canopy left. The tree's dead and on its way out. And I want to drive the point home that ash trees, they fall apart and dry out and become hazardous very quickly, which can really increase the cost for removal if the tree is located next to your house or in your backyard or in a location where it makes it more difficult to remove. companies will have to bring in larger equipment because it's no longer safe to climb. So you really want to deal with any ash tree that's in a location that if it, if it were to fail, that it could damage, persons or property. You want to deal with that before those trees are completely dead, because that really can increase the cost of removal, and it is quite dangerous. The trees fail quite rapidly, and within a few years after they die, most of them fail. So you want to be dealing with them before they're completely dead if they're in a location where they can't just die and fall apart without causing damage to something else. All right. So distribution of emerald ash borer in Minnesota. So Polk County is the 52nd county to have emerald ash borer identified. And so what you see right now is a picture of the Department of Agriculture's emerald ash borer status map. You can see the URL in the top part of the picture. And so this is updated nightly with new infested trees that are reported in that we can confirm. And what's important about this map is that it shows locations where EAB is. It shows where quarantine counties are. So any county that has had an emerald ash borer detection is under some level of quarantine, which I'll talk about more about here in a moment, which restricts the movement of any firewood or any ash products out of the quarantine area to the non-quarantine area. And also on this, we have what we call the generally infested area. And so that's a buffer we put around confirmed infested tree locations. So that's probably the biggest takeaway from this map that I want you to walk away with, is that these generally infested areas, it starts at a 2-mile buffer and then expands as some more trees are identified in area. But if you were within a generally infested area, the way to think about that is that there's a good chance that your ash tree is already infested at some level, whether showing signs of infestation or not, if it's not being treated with insecticide. And that's just due to the cryptic nature of emerald ash borer and it always being further beyond what you can visibly see in the environment. So the average spread rate without human assisted movement is about 1 to 2 miles a year for the insect. And so given that it takes 2 to 3 years to see symptoms in a tree, it's already spread beyond what you can physically see in the area. And so that's why we put that buffer around it. And if you're within the generally infested area, you should start beginning to actively manage immediately on how you're going to deal with the ash trees on your property. On top of that, if you're within 10 to 15 miles of that generally infested area, that's if you want to treat and protect your trees, that's a good time to begin. That's kind of the general rule of thumb. Once you're within 10 to 15 miles of a known infested area, that's if you want to save your ash trees, that's when you should start treatments. Yeah, and so we're just the generally infested area is really just trying to better represent what emerald ash borer is doing out in that area where it's impacting trees, because we get individual tree reports, but we're not documenting every single tree that's infested. So the map is trying to represent a geographic area of where we know emerald ash borer is impacting trees. And so if you think you found emerald ash borer and you're outside of that infested area, please report that to us. We really could use help from knowledgeable citizens throughout the state helping us identify emerald ash borer as it moves into new areas. And I'll give you the reporting information at the end of this presentation. And so if we zoom in here, just kind of showing more of the area around Polk County, we have an infestation in Sauk Center, and then down by Albany along 94, and then over in Richmond, Minnesota, in Stearns County, and then also in Spicer, Minnesota, and Canada-Yohi County, just north of Wilmer. So it's starting to fill in around that area, and it's likely being underreported. So there's a good chance there's more emerald ash borer than out in those areas than what we're seeing on this map. So if you do find stuff, please let us know about it and take pictures if you can. And if you zoom into where it was found in Polk County, it was Glenwood Township. And so it's been found in a couple of locations about 2 miles apart. Unfortunately, those dots don't show up very well. But it was kind of found right there by 195th Avenue near Highway 55. Then also along Memorial Drive near the intersection with County Road 21. So those are kind of the 2 pockets of where infested trees have been identified so far. And I imagine there's going to be more reported in the near future. MDA does like to delimit infestations. They're found in new areas. So this next fall or winter, we will try to go back up there and drive through the area and try to identify where other visibly infested trees are showing up. But so you can see that generally infested area buffer around those points. If you're in the Glenwood area, there's a good chance EAB's already impacting your trees. And if you're over in Starbuck and things like that on the other side of the lake, now is probably the time, if you don't want to lose your ash trees, to begin thinking about doing insecticide treatments. And so you can find all this information on our Emerald Ash Borer status map. Once again, that URL is right up there. They do have tools where you can measure the distance you are from known infested areas and things like that. All right, so regulations. We have some regulations associated with emerald ash borer to try to slow the human-assisted element of emerald ash borer spread, to try to keep it from spreading to new areas as quick. And so really the purpose of a quarantine is to reduce or eliminate that spread of the pest through human-assisted movement. And so what we're doing is we're restricting pest movement while facilitating trade. So we have compliance agreements if you do work with, say, firewood or are doing other sort of tree care or moving products that are regulated. We have processes that you can contact us for if you need help facilitating your trade due to the restrictions that are now put in place for the area. And so we have both an internal quarantine, as you can see on the left, and an external quarantine. And so that internal quarantine is where we have quarantine counties that restrict the movement of any ash material, emerald ash borer life stage or hardwood firewood out of the quarantine area to non-quarantine areas. And then we also have an external quarantine that restricts the movement of those materials into the state from, say, Canada, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. So they're not allowed to bring that material into the state as well. And so, what our regulations, our regulated articles are any ash material. So any pieces of ash trees, any emerald ash borer life stage, mulch, and all hardwood firewood. And that's cut, that hardwood firewood is any hardwood species of tree cut to 4-foot lengths or less. And we say that because the average person cannot tell what species of wood is in a cut pile of firewood. No matter how much people think they may be able to do it, it often can get mixed in and people will miss it. And so that's why all hardwood firewood is regulated. And emerald ash borer isn't the only pest that could potentially be spread through that pathway. So it's a good habit to get into to buy firewood where you're going to burn it and not transport it long distances. And so here's just some pictures of the different regulated articles. You can see ash logs, mulch, and then split firewood, whether it's split or not, and those bundles of firewood. And so movement of these regulated articles. And so you can see we have kind of the red, it means stop, don't move with those arrows. The yellow is caution. You can only transit through, but you can't stay overnight. So you can go from an uninfested area to another uninfested area if you're driving through a known infested area, but you can't stop or stay overnight. You have to transit through that area. And then green means you're free to move. So you can see that within the quarantine area, you can move throughout any of the quarantine area freely with all these regulated articles if you're going to an adjacent quarantine county area. You can move freely in the non-quarantine area. You cannot move any of these regulated articles from a quarantine county to a non-quarantine county. And you can see the red arrow, say up there by Grand Forks. You cannot move those articles into Minnesota from out of state or out of the country like Canada. You can move those articles from a non-quarantine area into a quarantine area, but once it's moved into the quarantine area, it is now regulated as if it originated in the quarantine area. And so that's just kind of the general movement. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. I'll have my coworkers' contact information. If you have specific questions about, say, your firewood business or something like that, she'll be able to answer those questions for you. Just to give you an idea of the different treatment options, when if you're looking to get a compliance agreement to be able to move these regulated articles out of a quarantine, you can chip or grind. So that's usually using a tump grinder to get it down to 1 inch or less in 2 dimensions. You can debark logs and by removing all the bark plus a 1/2 inch of sapwood. You can compost, and that's going to require reaching 140 degrees for 4 days. And then heat treatment of firewood. So I believe we have 13 heat treatment certified firewood dealers in the state now. And that requires heating your firewood up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 minutes in a kiln. And the MDA does certify that. So we use temperature probes to certify kilns for firewood producers that would like to be certified. And then we have kiln dried. There's a specific moisture content, and then fumigation as well as options for treatment to get a compliance agreement to move these articles out of a quarantine area. And I'll just to mention again the definition of firewood. So it's wood cut to lengths less than 4 feet long, split or not, whether it's for commercial or private use, and it's all hardwood species. And so if you have, say, a maple tree or something like that that you want to move, if you can leave it in lengths longer than 4 feet in length, it's legal to do so. But once it's less than 4 feet in length, it's considered firewood, and it's not allowed. And just to reiterate, firewood cannot enter from Canada or other neighboring states. It cannot leave the emerald ash borer quarantine or the spongy moth quarantine, which is another forest pest up in Lake and Cook counties in far northeastern Minnesota along the North Shore. But firewood can move around within the pest quarantine. It can move around outside of the pest quarantine, or it can move freely throughout the entire state if it's MDA heat treatment certified. So if it has that shield on the label, oftentimes you'll see that at like gas stations or big box stores where you buy it. If it has that certified logo, it is free to move throughout the entire state because it's been certified pest-free due to the heat treatment that it's gone through. All right, so here is Danielle DeVito's contact information. She is the regulatory specialist and coordinator for all of the emerald ash borer regulations and firewood regulations. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to her. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today for this meeting. I will post her information at the end as well in case you didn't have time to write it down. All right. And lastly, I'm just kind of driving this point home with firewood and how it is such a potential vector for transporting pests unknowingly. There's an ash log, but there's no outward visible signs on the bark of anything wrong with it. You peel off that bark, you find the emerald ash borer gallery, but there's still no insect. Well, you dig in a little bit, there's the emerald ash borer larva in its pupal chamber waiting to pupate and emerge at a new location. So this is really why we have these don't move firewood campaigns. Buy it where you're going to burn it, and yeah, don't move firewood long distances. All right, so next up is management. So there's a few things that can be done when managing emerald ash borer. I'm specifically going to be talking about kind of at the individual tree level or in a community. If you have large forested areas with a large ash component, you would be best off talking with DNR Forestry and their forest health team, and they have foresters that can help work with you on management plans. And if you are a private woodland owner, there are resources for cost share and helping develop an emerald ash borer management plan and recommendations on underplanting and things like that you can get. And so I'm talking more about at the city level and individual property owners. And so we have best management practices for dealing with emerald ash borer. So we're now in the emerald ash borer active period, which is May 1st through September 30th. We recommend trying to avoid doing removals of ash trees, doing pruning, doing any of that work on ash trees when the adult beetles are actively flying around. And we say this for a couple of reasons. With emerald ash borer active, a lot of times they will reinfest the same tree or a tree right next to it. And if you're removing an ash tree with emerald ash borer up in the canopy of the tree while they're being active, you're actually going to push them out to new trees faster when they would have probably just laid their eggs on that same tree. And if it were removed in the fall or winter, it could have been destroyed and you would have killed more emerald ash borer by doing it that way. And in addition, if the wood waste has to be moved to a new location to be processed, you could potentially be having emerald ash borer beetles flying out of that load as it's moved down the road to a new location. So ideally, it's best to wait until the fall to do a lot of this work. Um, Obviously, that's not always possible, and if it's an immediate hazard, you should deal with it as soon as possible instead of wait. And if you do have to work on ash trees in the summertime, if you can uh, leave the wood at on site at that location and not move it, or chip it before you move it to wherever it's going to be brought to. At the very least, cover your load if you have to transport it to a different site where it's going to be processed, if it's during the flight season. But ideally, you can do all that pruning and removal as desired October 1st through April 30th when those adult beetles aren't actively flying around. All right, so dealing with emerald ash borer, it really comes down to removals and treatments. Removals, can be done before emerald ash borer arrives. If you have poor quality ash trees, poorly sited trees, and a large number of them to deal with, you might want to start reducing the amount of ash resource that you have by removing those poor quality trees before emerald ash borer is even known to be there. Especially if you're a city or a county or a park system that has to manage a large number of trees. Doing some preemptive removals to reduce the amount of ash resource that you have is a really smart thing to do. Just due to the way that emerald ash borer works, once it's in an area and that population explodes, you start to have kind of mass tree mortality within a very short period, and it overwhelms your ability to deal with all those potentially hazard trees. So doing preemptive removals, if you're someone that's managing a large number of trees, could be a good idea if you have that option. Uh, you can target your removals of trees showing signs of infestation, so trees with that woodpecker damage. So you can see that they're further along than removing a tree that shows that woodpecker damage is going to remove more emerald ash borer than a tree adjacent to it that shows no woodpecker damage. So there's going to be a large proportion of emerald ash borer in those symptomatic trees. So that's one way to prioritize which trees you remove first. And then obviously you're going to have to remove dead trees. So trees that have already been fully killed and are now hazardous need to be removed off the landscape if they're in areas where they could fall and damage person and hurt people or damage property. Trees out in natural areas can be left to die and fall apart. Doing removals in a forested system is not really feasible. And then there are treatments. And so the insecticide treatments can be applied before emerald ash borer has arrived. So if you don't want to take much risk at all, you can start doing treatments before emerald ash borer is known to be in an area. And our general advice is once you know it's within 10 to 15 miles of your area is a good time to start doing those treatments. But you can still treat trees after they're lightly infested. So like I mentioned, as long as the tree has 70% of a healthy canopy or more, it's still a good candidate for treatment. And that tree is healthy enough to uptake that chemical and properly protect it. And so some things you want to consider when you're thinking about whether to do removal or treatment. How close is emerald ash borer to me? Like I just mentioned, is it within 10 miles of me? Is it in my community? Is it in the county over? How close is it? How healthy is the tree or trees that I am dealing with? Are they in good condition? Are they in good locations? Are they large, mature trees or are they smaller trees? Smaller trees are typically much easier to remove and get something new planted that will grow up to that size and start, giving out the same level of benefits faster. Where really large, mature trees take a long time to replace, and they might be a better, idea for or candidate for insecticide treatment. Especially if they give you most of your shade in the summertime, it can really be worth it, and it can also maintain property values as well. And sometimes with really large mature trees, they can be very expensive to remove in your yard. So you could potentially be treating a tree for 10, 15 years before you ever reach that what it would cost for removal. And then lastly, how many trees are you dealing with? Do you just have one, two trees, or do you have dozens of trees? So those are all things you need to take into consideration when you're thinking about whether you want to do removal or treatment. And so the treatment's available. There's a number of different chemicals available. I'll put the homeowner's guide to insecticide selection here in the chat. 1 second here. And they're all very effective as long as they're applied properly on a healthy enough tree. And they, so what happens is the tree, whether it's applied via trunk injection or soil drench or foliar spray, the tree will uptake it into its system. So any larval tunneling occurring once that tree is treated, they'll get a dose and kill the larvae underneath the bark. And any adult beetles that visit the tree and feed on the leaves will also get a dose and be killed as well. And so it's important to measure your tree to know what size it is. So there's a number of chemicals available to the average homeowner where you don't need a pesticide applicator license that may not be rated for a really large mature tree. So you really got to check the label and make sure that it's appropriate chemical to use on your specific tree. And really, once a tree is greater than 15 inches in diameter at breast height, so 4.5 feet above the ground, we recommend having it professionally treated. So the chemical that's used by tree care professionals that is a restricted use pesticide, it's emamectin benzoate, and it's applied via a trunk injection method. And so that is guaranteed for 2 years, and it before it needs to be reapplied again. The common chemicals that the average homeowner can buy is typically a soil drench, and it's usually the active ingredient is imidacloprid or something like that, which is a neonicotinoid. So you have to be careful with pollinators and groundwater as well. And those need to be reapplied every year. So really, if you have a large mature tree that you don't want to lose and you want to invest in treatment, we really suggest having it professionally treated. And so here is kind of a picture of showing the general condition of trees that are treatable. So you can see the image on the left is a healthy tree. It's a great candidate for treatment. The image in the middle is a tree that's still healthy enough to be treated, although you can see some thinning and decline there. And then that tree on the right is too far gone, is no longer a good candidate for treatment. And keep in mind that insecticide treatment stops it where it's at. It's not going to fully come back from whatever damage has been done. So this is something that just will stop things where it's at and protect it from there on out. And yeah, so it's, treatment is a great option, especially for individual trees. It can be a great strategy for cities to use to maintain tree canopy and to basically take more control over the rate at which they have to do tree removals. When emerald ash borer builds up and explodes in an area, having a lot of trees die in a short amount of time, it can really overwhelm a city's capacity to deal with all those infested trees on public property. So you may not plan to treat the tree for the life of the tree, but it can be used in the short term, say for a couple of rounds to slow the rate at which you have to do tree removals, and you can do it more on your timetable. And you can also save the really high quality trees as well to maintain canopy as you get other things planted and growing up and to enough size where it starts giving off those same benefits. So there's many different ways it can be used. There's not a correct answer for any single situation, but just keep in mind that treatment is a good option for many. All right. Lastly is management priorities. As you go from an uninfested area to a heavily infested area, your priorities change. So, detecting and reporting infestations is really important before you're known to be infested, or if you're nearby a known infested area. And then planning and inventory. So having an emerald ash borer management plan and an inventory of the ash trees you have in your community is really important because it's hard to manage properly when you don't know what the resource is out there. So taking an inventory and having that done, it will lead to much better outcomes as a community. And once that emerald ash borer arrives and you're kind of that generally infested, focusing on treating high value trees and timely sanitation and removal of the other infested trees is important. And once that population really explodes and you start seeing kind of mass tree mortality, minimizing that wood movement and trying to do safe disposal and any utilization of the wood that you can. And lastly, here are some Department of Natural Resources, Forestry Division resources. There's the DNR Forest Stewardship Program that can advise private forest land owners on forest management of VAB. They do have some access to cost share for forest management issues and projects. There's the URL there for if you have questions for them or would like assistance. And then if you're a community, if you're a city, not a local unit of government, the DNR Urban and Community Forestry Program received money last year from the legislature to grant out to communities. There should be another round of grant money available at some point this year. You can see the URLs available right there. And that provides assistance to communities to help with ash removals, replacements, treatments. It even provides money to help come with a management plan or perform an ash inventory. So if you are a local community that could use some assistance, I really suggest going to that website and taking a look at what that application looks like, because it won't change much once that next proposal comes due. And so I would expect, sometime late summer or early fall, there to be another round of grant money available for communities out there. And you can see the other links to the community forester maps in your area for other resources and people to contact for help. All right, and lastly, reporting. So if you think you found emerald ash borer in a new area, please take pictures, notes. We want pictures of say the insect tunneling patterns, the woodpecker damage, anything that makes you think it's emerald ash borer. And you can report that to a local city forester through EdMaps, or more importantly, to Department of Ag's Report a Pest. So we have an online form, that email, or a voicemail that you can call. And please be detailed with the location and the symptoms that you're seeing. Pictures are really, really helpful. And that is all I have for you. Thanks for attending, everybody, and I can take any questions that you might have. All right, so what is a safe disposal area for a homeowner? You can burn on site if you have a bonfire pit or do anything like that. That's a perfectly good way to deal with it. Or you can take it to the nearest brush disposal site for the city or county. You just don't want to be moving that wood longer distances to a cabin or something like that. All right, so any word on how old the infestations looked around Glenwood? Yeah, so I looked at one of the sites. It's probably been there at least 4 or 5 years. There were dozens of trees that were impacted that were, getting to the point where it's almost at tree mortality. So my best guess would be probably right around 5 years. Ash is the main host. There is a secondary host, which is the white fringe tree, but that's not native to Minnesota. But it's an ornamental shrub that you sometimes see planted in landscaped areas, but it's rarely found in yards in Minnesota. So it's just ash, anything in the Fraxinus species. Yes, homeowners, if they want to keep the wood, they are able to tarp the wood and keep it on site. You just can't move it out of the quarantine area. Any other questions? Windrows and whatnot, that's a tough one to deal with. I would start removing, some of them and replanting with other species, just so you don't have to do it all at once, or treatment if they want to. Any infestations in Alexandria and Miltona? No, we have not found emerald ash borer in that area. And I would refer you to check that emerald ash borer status map if you're wondering where we have confirmed it anywhere in the state. There is no special license for a tree trimmer to deal with emerald ash borer. Um, can you elaborate? Is the strength of chemical less prior to infestation? I'm not quite sure what you're asking. Oh, yeah, for treatments before infestations are known in the area. No, you have to use the whatever it says on the label to protect the tree. So um, using a less concentration is not a viable option. Yes, there is some research into spreading out treatments to every 3 years. What I'll say about that is, once you're in an area where emerald ash borer has been there for a number of years and the insect pressure really builds up pretty high levels, if you're dealing with individual trees, you want to stick to that 2 year treatment window if you want to avoid any potential damage to your tree. Um, if you are a city that's managing a larger number of trees, a 3 year treatment regimen uh, is a possibility, just because you can deal with a little bit of decline in some of those trees since you're managing so many. That's more viable. But if as an individual tree goes, sticking to the 2 year regimen is advised to make sure there's no potential damage to your tree. But yeah, it is a good option for cities that have a large number of trees to manage. It can make their funds go a longer way, and it can help them deal with, the rate at which trees die in their community more effectively. So far, it's showing good evidence that long term the treatments are very viable. We're not seeing much damage, at least from the trunk injection stuff research that's come out. So it seems to be very viable. If you stop treatment, emerald ash borer will eventually kill your tree. So it's for the life of the tree, unfortunately, as emerald ash borer will persist in the environment. I don't know, maybe 20 years down the road after emerald ash borer, the main wave has gone through and it killed all the untreated ash, whether the treatment window will be able to be stretched out any further. But you won't ever be able to not treat if you want to keep the tree protected. Long-term cost, it depends on the chemical and how much you're paying for it, or if you're doing it yourself. Um, what I typically say is it's usually about $10 to $12 a diameter inch to have your tree professionally treated. If you're a community that invests in the equipment, or um, you have a large number of people that come together to do a treatment that could reduce the cost considerably. I know communities that are treating trees in-house for around $4 a diameter inch, but the average homeowner, it's going to be about $10 to $12 a diameter inch. Manchurian ash, it's definitely more resistant because it co-evolved with emerald ash borer in its native range. But the Manchurian ash that I've seen planted in infested areas have been killed by emerald ash borer. So I don't know how much of a great option that is for replanting or anything like that. Unfortunately, no, there is not a cost share program for homeowners that have a lot of ash on their property that isn't considered a forest. All the chemicals are very effective, but the one that's typically used on large mature trees is the amamectin benzoate. That's the most common and the one most researched. Private woodland owners. So however the DNR defines that, I think it's at least 8 acres. And that does not include egg land. So correct. I believe it is 8 acres or larger. So the URL is right there. If you look up Minnesota DNR Forest Stewardship Program, you'll find the information you can for uh, more details on their program. And if you have any questions that you think of after we're finished here, feel free to shoot me an email, and I can send you other resources in an email of links and things like that. Yes, it's like a 99% mortality rate. So any mature ash tree in an area will be infested and killed for time. In a community, we typically see it, 12 to 15 years is what the length of time that it typically takes to run through a community. It's usually identified, and it takes a few years for that before that population really explodes, and you really start to see the impacts. And emerald ash borer itself can infest anything, down to an inch in diameter. So they can really get into small trees as well. We do have a biological control program that we do have 5 active release sites in the state. What's required is at least 40 acres of forested land with at least a 25% ash component with emerald ash borer present for it to be a potential release site. MDA coordinates that. So if you have locations that meet those requirements, we can put into for a release site in future years. That's still not going to stop emerald ash borer from moving through an area and killing all the large mature trees, but it could potentially help keep ash in the natural ecosystem in the long term. At least 40 acres with a 25% ash component with emerald ash borer present. So emerald ash borer has to be there to be able to do releases because the parasitoids require emerald ash borer to complete their life cycle. Disposal sites in Polk County, I don't know off the top of my head. I would suggest getting in contact with the county. They should have information on that if you contact Pope County. The quarantine will be in effect until regulations are rescinded. So um, I'm not sure how long that will be. Um, as emerald ash borer continues to spread throughout the state, at some point, those regulations will likely go away. So, it could be a year, it could be multiple years. I'm not sure. Biological controls, there's three types of very host-specific parasitoid wasps. Two of them attack the larval stage and one attacks the egg stage. We've been releasing them in Minnesota since 2010, and they are established in the Twin Cities, the southeastern part of the state, and up in Duluth as well. And so work on that is ongoing to see how effective they will be. And I just put a link in there to our biological control webpage for emerald ash borer. You can see where releases have occurred. You can see what the three types of parasitoid wasps look like and where they've been recovered. All right, I'm going to have to end it here. So please reach out if you have any other questions that come up. Feel free to shoot me an email. This is recorded, and I'll try to get this posted on our MDA website within the next couple of days. So hopefully by Monday, I'll have it up there. Thank you all for attending. This great attendance, great questions, and yeah. Um, thank you, everybody.